KaraokeBooks.
In Search of Lost Time. Swann's Way. Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K.Scott-Moncrieff. Having exhausted this topic, to which she had been inspired by the loftiness of her plume, the monogram on her card case, the little number inked inside each of her gloves by the cleaner, and the difficulty of speaking to Swann about the Verdurins, me. Cottard, seeing that they had still a long way to go before they would reach the corner of the Rue Bonaparte, where the conductor was to set her down, listened to the promptings of her heart, which counseled other words than these. "Your ears must have been burning," she ventured, "while we were on the yacht with me. Verdurin. We were talking about you all the time." Swann was genuinely astonished, for he supposed that his name was never uttered in the Verdurin's presence. "You see, me." Cottard went on, "Me. De Crécy was there. Need I say more? When Odette is anywhere, it's never long before she begins talking about you. And you know quite well, it isn't nasty things she says." "What? You don't believe me," she went on, noticing that Swann looked skeptical. And, carried away by the sincerity of her conviction, without putting any evil meaning into the word, which she used purely in the sense in which one employs it to speak of the affection that unites a pair of friends. "Why, she adores you. No, indeed, I'm sure it would never do to say anything against you when she was about. One would soon be taught one's place. Whatever we might be doing, if we were looking at a picture, for instance, she would say, if only we had him here. He's the man who could tell us whether it's genuine or not. There's no one like him for that." And all day long she would be saying, "What can he be doing just now? I do hope he's doing a little work. It's too dreadful that a fellow with such gifts as he has should be so lazy. Forgive me, won't you? I can see him this very moment. He's thinking of us, he's wondering where we are." Indeed, she used an expression which I thought very pretty at the time. M. Verdurin asked her, "How in the world can you see what he's doing, when he's 8,000 miles away?" And Odette answered, "Nothing is impossible to the eye of a friend." No, I assure you, I'm not saying it just to flatter you. You have a true friend in her, such as one doesn't often find. I can tell you, besides, in case you don't know it, that you're the only one. Me. Verdurin told me as much herself on our last day with them. One talks more freely, don't you know, before a parting. I don't say that Odette isn't fond of us, but anything that we may say to her counts for very little beside what Swann might say. Oh, mercy, there's the conductor stopping for me. Here have I been chatting away to you, and would have gone right past the Rue Bonaparte, and never noticed. Will you be so very kind as to tell me whether my plume is straight? And me. Cottard withdrew from her muff, to offer it to Swann, a white-gloved hand from which there floated, with a transfer ticket, an atmosphere of fashionable life that pervaded the omnibus, blended with the harsher fragrance of newly cleaned kid. And Swann felt himself overflowing with gratitude to her, as well as to me. Verdurin, and almost to Odette, for the feeling that he now entertained for her was no longer tinged with pain, was scarcely even to be described, now, as love, while from the platform of the omnibus he followed her with loving eyes, as she gallantly threaded her way along the Rue Bonaparte, her plume erect, her skirt held up in one hand, while in the other she clasped her umbrella and her card case, so that its monogram could be seen, her muff dancing in the air before her as she went. To compete with and so to stimulate the moribund feelings that Swann had for Odette, me. Cottard, a wiser physician, in this case, than ever her husband would have been, had grafted among them others more normal, feelings of gratitude, of friendship, which in Swann's mind were to make Odette seem again more human, more like other women, since other women could inspire the same feelings in him, were to hasten her final transformation back into that Odette, loved with an undisturbed affection, who had taken him home one evening after a revel at the painter's, to drink orangeade with Forcheville, that Odette with whom Swann had calculated that he might live in happiness. In former times, having often thought with terror that a day must come when he would cease to be in love with Odette, he had determined to keep a sharp lookout, and as soon as he felt that love was beginning to escape him, to cling tightly to it and to hold it back. But now, to the faintness of his love there corresponded a simultaneous faintness in his desire to remain her lover. For a man cannot change, that is to say become another person, while he continues to obey the dictates of the self which he has ceased to be. Occasionally the name, if it caught his eye in a newspaper, of one of the men whom he supposed to have been Odette's lovers, reawakened his jealousy. But it was very slight, and, inasmuch as it proved to him that he had not completely emerged from that period in which he had so keenly suffered, though in it he had also known a way of feeling so intensely happy, and that the accidents of his course might still enable him to catch an occasional glimpse, stealthily and at a distance, of its beauties, this jealousy gave him, if anything, an agreeable thrill, as to the sad Parisian, when he has left Venice behind him and must return to France. The last mosquito proves that Italy and summer are still not too remote. But, as a rule, with this particular period of his life from which he was emerging, when he made an effort, if not to remain in it, at least to obtain, while still he might, an uninterrupted view of it, he discovered that already it was too late. He would have looked back to distinguish, as it might be a landscape that was about to disappear, that love from which he had departed. But it is so difficult to enter into a state of complete duality and to present to oneself the lifelike spectacle of a feeling which one has ceased to possess, that very soon, the clouds gathering in his brain, he could see nothing. He would abandon the attempt, would take the glasses from his nose and wipe them, and he told himself that he would do better to rest for a little, that there would be time enough later on, and settled back into his corner with as little curiosity, with as much torpor as the drowsy traveler who pulls his cap down over his eyes so as to get some sleep in the railway carriage that is drawing him. He feels faster and faster, out of the country in which he has lived for so long. Indeed, like the same traveler, if he does not awake until he has crossed the frontier and is again in France, when Swann happened to alight, close at hand, upon something which proved that Forcheville had been Odette's lover, he discovered that it caused him no pain, that love was now utterly remote, and he regretted that he had had no warning of the moment in which he had emerged from it forever. And just as, before kissing Odette for the first time, he had sought to imprint upon his memory the face that for so long had been familiar, before it was altered by the additional memory of their kiss, so he could have wished, in thought at least, to have been in a position to bid farewell, while she still existed, to that Odette who had inspired love in him and jealousy, to that Odette who had caused him so to suffer, and whom now he would never see again. He was mistaken. He was destined to see her once again, a few weeks later. It was while he was asleep, in the twilight of a dream. He was walking with me. Verdurin, Drive. Cottard, a young man in a fez whom he failed to identify, the painter, Odette, Napoleon III and my grandfather, along a path which followed the line of the coast, and overhung the sea, now at a great height, now by a few feet only, so that they were continually going up and down. Those of the party who had reached the downward slope were no longer visible to those who were still climbing. What little daylight yet remained was failing, and it seemed as though a black night was immediately to fall on them. Now and then the waves dashed against the cliff, and Swann could feel on his cheek a shower of freezing spray. Odette told him to wipe this off, but he could not, and felt confused and helpless in her company, as well as because he was in his nightshirt. He hoped that, in the darkness, this might pass unnoticed. Verdurin, however, fixed her astonished gaze upon him for an endless moment, in which he saw her face change its shape, her nose grow longer, while beneath it there sprouted a heavy mustache. He turned away to examine Odette. Her cheeks were pale, with little fiery spots, her features drawn and ringed with shadows. But she looked back at him with eyes welling with affection, ready to detach themselves like tears and to fall upon his face, and he felt that he loved her so much that he would have liked to carry her off with him at once. Suddenly Odette turned her wrist, glanced at a tiny watch, and said, "I must go." She took leave of everyone, in the same formal manner, without taking Swann aside, without telling him where they were to meet that evening or next day. He dared not ask, he would have liked to follow her, he was obliged, without turning back in her direction, to answer with a smile some question by me. Verdurin, but his heart was frantically beating. He felt that he now hated Odette. He would gladly have crushed those eyes which, a moment ago, he had loved so dearly, have torn the blood into those lifeless cheeks. He continued to climb with me. Verdurin, that is to say that each step took him farther from Odette, who was going downhill, and in the other direction. A second passed and it was many hours since she had left him. The painter remarked to Swann that Napoleon III had eclipsed himself immediately after Odette. They had obviously arranged it between them, he added. They must have agreed to meet at the foot of the cliff, but they wouldn't say goodbye together. It might have looked odd. She is his mistress. The strange young man burst into tears. Swann endeavored to console him. After all, she is quite right, he said to the young man, drying his eyes for him and taking off the fez to make him feel more at ease. I've advised her to do that, myself, a dozen times. Why be so distressed? He was obviously the man to understand her. So Swann reasoned with himself, for the young man whom he had failed, at first, to identify, was himself also. Like certain novelists, he had distributed his own personality between two characters, him who was the first person in the dream, and another whom he saw before him, capped with a fez. As for Napoleon III, it was too forceful that some vague association of ideas, then a certain modification of the Baron's usual physiognomy, and lastly the broad ribbon of the Legion of Honor across his breast, had made Swann give that name. But actually, and in everything that the person who appeared in his dream represented and recalled to him, it was indeed forceful. For, from an incomplete and changing set of images, Swann in his sleep drew false deductions, enjoying, at the same time, such creative power that he was able to reproduce himself by a simple act of division, like certain lower organisms. With the warmth that he felt in his own palm he modeled the hollow of a strange hand which he thought that he was clasping, and out of feelings and impressions of which he was not yet conscious, he brought about sudden vicissitudes which, by a chain of logical sequences, would produce, at definite points in his dream, the person required to receive his love or to startle him awake. In an instant night grew black about him, an alarum rang, the inhabitants ran past him, escaping from their blazing houses. He could hear the thunder of the surging waves, and also of his own heart, which, with equal violence, was anxiously beating in his breast. Suddenly the speed of these palpitations redoubled. He felt a pain, a nausea that were inexplicable. A peasant, dreadfully burned, flung at him as he passed. Come and ask Charles where Odette spent the night with her friend. He used to go about with her, and she tells him everything. It was they that started the fire. It was his valet, come to awaken him, and saying, Sir, it is 8 o'clock, and the barber is here. I have told him to call again in an hour. But these words, as they dived down through the waves of sleep in which Swann was submerged, did not reach his consciousness without undergoing that refraction which turns a ray of light, at the bottom of a bowl of water, into another sun. Just as, a moment earlier, the sound of the door bell, swelling in the depths of his abyss of sleep into the clangor of an alarum, had engendered the episode of the fire. Meanwhile the scenery of his dream stage scattered in dust. He opened his eyes, heard for the last time the boom of a wave in the sea, grown very distant. He touched his cheek. It was dry. And yet he could feel the sting of the cold spray, and the taste of salt on his lips. He rose, and dressed himself. He had made the barber come early because he had written, the day before, to my grandfather, to say that he was going, that afternoon, to Cambrai, having learned that de Cambremer, Marcel, Legrandin that had been, was spending a few days there. The association in his memory of her young and charming face with a place in the country which he had not visited for so long, offered him a combined attraction which had made him decide at last to leave Paris for a while. As the different changes and chances that bring us into the company of certain other people in this life do not coincide with the periods in which we are in love with those people, but, overlapping them, may occur before love has begun, and may be repeated after love is ended, the earliest appearances, in our life, of a creature who is destined to afford us pleasure later on, assume retrospectively in our eyes a certain value as an indication, a warning, a presage. It was in this fashion that Swann had often carried back his mind to the image of Odette, encountered in the theater, on that first evening when he had no thought of ever seeing her again, and that he now recalled the party at de Saint-Euverte's, at which he had introduced General de Froberval to me. De Cambremer. So manifold are our interests in life that it is not uncommon that, on a single occasion, the foundations of a happiness which does not yet exist are laid down simultaneously with aggravations of a grief from which we are still suffering. And, no doubt, that might have occurred to Swann elsewhere than at de Saint-Euverte's. Who, indeed, can say whether, in the event of his having gone, that evening, somewhere else, other happinesses, other griefs would not have come to him, which, later, would have appeared to have been inevitable? But what did seem to him to have been inevitable was what had indeed taken place, and he was not far short of seeing something providential in the fact that he had at last decided to go to de Saint-Euverte's that evening, because his mind, anxious to admire the richness of invention that life shows, and incapable of facing a difficult problem for any length of time, such as to discover what, actually, had been most to be wished for, came to the conclusion that the sufferings through which he had passed that evening, and the pleasures, at that time unsuspected, which were already being brought to birth, the exact balance between which was too difficult to establish, were linked by a sort of concatenation of necessity. But while, an hour after his awakening, he was giving instructions to the barber, so that his stiffly brushed hair should not become disarranged on the journey, he thought once again of his dream. He saw once again, as he had felt them close beside him, Odette's pallid complexion, her too thin cheeks, her drawn features, her tired eyes, all the things which, in the course of those successive bursts of affection which had made of his enduring love for Odette a long oblivion of the first impression that he had formed of her, he had ceased to observe after the first few days of their intimacy, days to which, doubtless, while he slept, his memory had returned to seek the exact sensation of those things. And with that old, intermittent fatuity, which reappeared in him now that he was no longer unhappy, and lowered, at the same time, the average level of his morality, he cried out in his heart, "To think that I have wasted years of my life, that I have longed for death, that the greatest love that I have ever known has been for a woman who did not please me, who was not in my style."
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.